Hi, my name is Jennifer New. I am the Associate Director at the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. And the Obermann Center supports faculty research on campus. And one thing that we like to do is to find ways for that very important research to get shared in a more public manner. And so this series, Obermann Conversations, brings together scholars, artists, various researchers on the university campus and puts them in conversation with other experts from our community around shared topics of expertise and passion. We do one of these each month during both the fall and the spring semester. And so right now, our spring lineup is just sort of coming together. And so I'll just give you a little preview of a few of those. We will be talking about the impacts on community health and well-being of ICE raids. And that will be February 4th with faculty from both the College of Public Health and the College of Education, as well as somebody from the Eastern Iowa Bond Board. And then on March 11th, we will be doing an Obermann conversation on the art and science of attention. So how actually does the brain create and hold attention with a professor in psychological and brain sciences. I believe that's one of those departments that's increased the length of its name, so you cannot pay attention to it as well. So anyway, as well as with a mindfulness meditation teacher and a rock climber. So all of those looking at how attention occurs in the brain and then how we cultivate attention. So those are coming up in both February, and then that second one is March 11th. Today, we're looking at the relationships between domestic workers and employees, how this has changed over time, including how these issues play out around race and gender and also immigration status. We have with us today 3 speakers, and then I'm actually going to be handing off the role of facilitator. So on the far end is Catherine Stewart. We've been thrilled to have Catherine as a fellow-in-residence at the Obermann Center last spring and through the summer and then through this fall. She is a history professor from Cornell College, and she's working on a book called The New Maid, African American Women and Domestic Service During the New Deal, which provides a much-needed social and cultural history of African American women who labored as household workers during the New Deal. And next to her is Jennifer Scher, who is the director of the University of Iowa's Labor Center. And Jennifer oversees statewide outreach, engagement, and research projects on labor issues. And then sitting next to Jennifer is Fatima Saeed, who is a home healthcare worker and a member of the board for the Center for Worker Justice here in Iowa City, and is also an artist. And then finally, closest to me is Donna Cleveland, who has very kindly come up from Fairfield today. Donna is a journalism graduate of the University of Iowa, and she is a magazine editor and the producer of a podcast, a feminist podcast called Thread the Needle. And she's already done a few episodes that relate to household work and domestic work, and having listened to those, I thought Donna would be a great person to actually lead today's conversation. And she's doing an upcoming episode that will feature Jennifer Scher, as well as an Eastern Iowa cleaning service that is owned and operated by a local Latina woman in Fairfield. So with further ado, we will get started on today's conversation.
Thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to say a couple more things about my podcast and how it relates to today's topic. Jennifer got in touch with me because she listened to my housework episode, and that was inspired after having frustrations at home in my relationship over splitting up the housework. You know, many people have experienced this. and realizing that it fits into a larger trend of women still doing the majority of this work. And when I realized how it related to this topic was that a lot of people's solutions is to hire people to come into their home to do this work, to stop the marital conflicts and outsource that. But this is a historically exploited group and still exploited workforce. And so I'm really excited to do this episode to look at how to avoid exploiting this workforce and really to learn the whole history of this area. So I'm excited to be here today. Our first question that we wanted to explore is, why is the domestic workforce considered an exploited workforce? And Catherine was going to start us off.
Thanks. Well, welcome everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. Thanks so much for coming today. It's such an important and such a timely topic, and as was explained, as a historian whose work in this particular book focus is really on the 1920s and 1930s, so that's kind of my area of expertise, and then we have others here to talk about it in a more contemporary setting. But certainly speaking about it from a historic point of view, and even a contemporary one, as you're probably aware, it's very physically demanding work, and I think something that's very often left out of that equation in terms of the work and the labor versus the compensation, which is the central kind of rub of the problem here, is that it's also very psychologically demanding work. So it's physically demanding, but it's also emotionally demanding. And certainly the 1920s and 30s, when we're talking about household laborers within private homes, a lot of the work they're doing is what other historians have called emotional labor. And so they're there to support the families in every way, not just in terms of material resources, providing meals and the like and cleaning, but also in terms of actual emotional and psychological support for homemakers and their dependents. And so I think that's kind of something that very often is left out of the equation of how hard this work actually is and how undercompensated it is. So just to give you a sense of that historically, the workers I'm looking at, and this is actually true not just in the South. I started looking at workers in the South in the 1930s, and then I just got back from a trip to DC where I got to get into the National Archives and get kind of the broader picture, a more national picture of this as well. It's also true for Northern workers, that you have basically a system where many workers are working anywhere between 12 to 16 hours a day. Very often that schedule is 6 days a week. Most of them are actually working 7 days a week. If they're fortunate, working for good employers, they were lucky to get one afternoon, sometimes 2 afternoons off a week. But you can imagine what a demanding schedule that is. In many cases, there was a pay scale range that did vary by region, as you might imagine, and also by household employer. But very often a typical wage for that type of work, that intense work schedule, was usually $1 a day. So if you work that out, we're talking about 10 cents an hour, very often for household laborers who had worked for the same family for many years. There's also a high labor turnover, as you might imagine, with this type of very challenging, difficult work, but that's certainly one of the aspects. So one of the things you see in domestic workers of the time period continually requesting is wage increases, and this is where we really get into a problem with the New Deal. In that New Deal legislation, which was put in place to help workers in terms of maximum numbers of hours and minimum wages, did not apply to domestic workers. And you can kind of go right down the line of New Deal labor legislation, really beginning with 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was setting wage standards and minimum wage standards for industrial workers and leaving domestic workers and very often agricultural workers out of those legislative acts. The Social Security Act of 1935 also excluded domestic workers. The Wagner Act of 1935, which was trying to guarantee workers the right to collective action, the right to form unions and collectively bargain, also excluded domestic workers, all the way up to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which was also excluding domestic workers from various types of protection. So it's not only an exploited labor force, it's a labor force that really is not being given any support or any advocacy directly in terms of the passage of laws that would set national standards. And that becomes kind of an ongoing crux of the matter during the 1930s. So workers at the time complained about wages, but I also want to point out that many of them, and particularly African American workers that I'm looking at, are complaining about treatment within the home. So they are denied personhood in terms of the hours they're working. They're denied any opportunity for rest, for relaxation, for recreation. Many of them cannot make it to church services, which was a very important part for many of these people in their communities because of their work hours. And there's all kinds of ways in which they're denied their sense of their own autonomous life. And you can imagine that that intensive work schedule also prevents workers from actually tending to their own households. When are they supposed to be going home, making meals for family, doing domestic chores at home, doing caretaking of children and the like? So it really is not just about an exploited labor force, but it's really about degradation of humanity in many ways in terms of what's happening to workers in this time period.
I was wondering, I just had a question about what you said. During this time frame, like how many women this impacted generally, and then also in your research, if you were able to find like justifications for why this workforce wasn't protected, like what were they saying at the time to try to justify?
There's always, with historians, there's always a divided opinion on that last question. But to start with the first one, I think that's a really important one to get a sense of the lay of the land in terms of the demographics of the group I'm looking at in the 1930s. According to the 1930 census, 53% of African American female labor force were working in quote unquote domestic and personal service, and I'll complicate that in just a minute. In cities like Atlanta, you had over 90% of black women wage earners who were working in domestic service. It was considered an occupation that was always available, always open, unfortunately, for women of color, both in the South and also in the North, even though there's a large immigrant group also taking those jobs and positions in the North. And to answer kind of your second question, one of the complications or problems of this really has to do with how domestic workers were defined. And so many private employers at the time period, even though they express concern and express sympathy and in some cases get involved in reform activity for domestic workers, when it comes to establishing laws that would create national standards for how they in their own household treat and pay workers that they feel are operating within the confines of their private autonomy, there's not a lot of support among household employers for those types of national wages. And this is, I think, one of the really interesting things and one of the really problematic things about domestic work, and when we're talking about private household workers, is that it is the home, it's the realm of the domestic home, which seems very much demarcated as a private space. Employers who are bringing domestic workers into their home are not interested in having to reach or meet standards that they feel are an encroachment of state authority coming into kind of their private households. There's also a big trade-off politically with FDR. I'm a big fan, I'll just be open about it, of the New Deal for a variety of reasons, but the New Deal completely failed a number of workers, certainly agricultural workers in this time period and domestic workers. And one of the reasons historians have argued for that is specifically that President Roosevelt, FDR was very concerned about keeping his constituency happy, and that constituency involved a large number of Southern whites who were Democrats who had helped him come into power in this time period, and he was concerned about losing them for some of his other more radical back-to-work plans and other plans like Social Security. So there's a couple different reasons why I think domestic workers are excluded. One of the things I hope to talk about, I want to take up all the time here, but the number of ways in which domestic workers of the time period advocate for themselves. So I said I just got back from the National Archives, and one of the most amazing sources I found were personal letters, handwritten letters from domestic workers all across the country addressed to Dear Mr. President and First Lady, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, begging them, requesting them to include domestic workers in the Fair Labor Standards Practices Act of 1938, asking them for legislation that would regulate wages and hours and compensation, and those cries went largely unheeded, certainly.
What's interesting, what comes to mind to me about that is this attitude of having a domestic worker who's part of the family almost, like doesn't sound in this situation like it benefits the worker by not professionalizing.
Right, and that's a whole other kind of area or can of worms we could open up, but that whole idea, certainly that's also for women of color who are working as domestic servants, primarily in the South, that's problematized for them, is this white Southern idea and mythology about enslavement, and specifically this white Southern idea that workers, and specifically enslaved individuals, and then after slavery, workers are like one of the family. And as long as they're using that parlance in terms of private domestic relationships, that justifies them not paying a living wage, because these are not really workers, they're part of the family. But as many African American writers have so aptly demonstrated, Alice Childress has a wonderful novel where she speaks in the voice of Mildred, the domestic worker of the 1950s. I'm not like one of the family if I'm not sitting down with the family at dinner. I'm not like one of the family if I'm actually excluded in all these ways that have to do with racial segregation of the Jim Crow period.
Now would be a good time, Jennifer, would you like to give more context of the New Deal and some of these labor laws that domestic workers were left out of?
Yeah, so I think Catherine gave us a great foundation and a great reminder that all of those exclusions of domestic workers and agricultural workers from those groundbreaking, game-changing pieces of federal legislation have their legacy in slavery, and that those exclusions, that legacy continues right up to the present in 2019. We've not remedied those structural inequalities, except in a very bit-by-bit, very slow, piecemeal fashion in a few ways that we can talk about in more detail as we go. And also that those exclusions and disparities in the exploitation of domestic and agricultural workers have their roots in the evolution of capitalism and its constant attempts to separate the realm of production from the realm of reproduction and the gendered nature of those distinctions. So I thought that was a great, entree to that. And if we think about where we are today, starting from the other end of the discussion, and the efforts that domestic workers themselves are continuing to engage in, to organize themselves, to demand improvements in their own individual situations, but then to also collectively press for policy changes. There's a lot of resonance between some of the historical examples and efforts that are underway today. And I know Catherine brought, I'm grateful that she brought some copies of materials from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, for example, which has emerged in the last decade as a really powerful collective and public voice for domestic workers in our country. Also want to mention this is a global movement right now. So people are having this very heated discussion and debate, not just on the state and the federal level here in the US, but globally in terms of the fundamental sort of questions. Who counts as a worker? What counts as a job? What does it mean to standardize and place expectations and parameters collectively as a society on how people are treated? And if the home happens to be the workplace, how do we raise the expectations within that space as well for people who are not quote unquote part of the family? So I think all of those are very live discussions. And to bring it down to the local level, this might be a good time also to turn to Fatima, because she's a board member of the Center for Worker Justice, and I've had the really great good fortune to get to know her over the last few years. And I would love to give her an opportunity to talk about how home workers in various occupations, whether that's cleaning services or the kind of home health care work that you're very dedicated to, are using the opportunity to organize together and address some of those conditions here. So.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening, everybody. It's a good opportunity to sit among this wonderful gathering to talk about the experience working as a direct care staff or somebody who caring is an important issue. I did learn this term before I came to the United States when I have some few friends. Let me just speak a little bit about my experience before coming to the United States and be American. am I an immigrant from Sudan? I consider to be one of the one who immigrate according to the background we have. We have a lot of people came from camps, refugee camps. We have a lot of people came from the border of wars. So coming to America, it's a dream to come for safety, the land of dignity, the land of organization, and to protect your rights. So I came to America with all these ideas because these hands are comfort us. Americans' hands comfort us when we get drought in Africa, in Sudan, when we get famine, when we get a lot of problems. American hands comfort us. So a person like me came and worked on this field. It would give me an honor to support people while they walk in their life and they need help. It's a time to give back. It's a time to be a family, to belong to this community. Some of us came to the United States as doctors, engineers, different backgrounds. When they came and find just a job, they will take it. They would like to work. They would like to help. They would like to be a person. Somebody would like to build this community. As a home care, through the time we build family values, because sometimes you find yourself with these individuals. They hug you, they talk to you. Sometimes they can't speak, but they could communicate with you with a lot of values. They could smile, they can pronounce your name. So all of that, it's a kind of building and bonding humans together. So we came from that disaster, from that losing land over there in our own home to come find families in here. So we're hungry to be having a family and giving back. So this is a challenging. You have to give from your heart. Working as a caregiver, you have to work from your heart. You don't have any other options. You just give from your heart because this is the gift. This is the gift. Being with individuals in their homes, that means you're responsible for their safety, for being healthy, for being happy. So we have to know this is a noble mission. This is a mission, maybe not everybody could do it because it needs patience, it needs understanding, and it needs love. So we still have families back there at wherever left them. We have families who are sick, who need helps, who are hungry, who are still struggling with life. So we need to help them. Sometimes $10 or $11 per hour is not going to support you as somebody working hard. And you find yourself, like between here and there, you have to support both. You still keep giving, still supporting, still giving from the heart. But at the same time, you need to send some support for the one who left behind. It's a little bit challenging. It's a little bit of, we need to sit down and talk a little bit. But still, I'm talking about the giving from the heart.
I just have a quick question for you about what you've said. Do you feel that you've been able to find with your work here, economic stability, like you've talked a little bit about it being challenging to send money back home, respect, things like that? I'm curious to hear what your experience has been with that. And giving from the heart, do you feel like that's been reciprocated or appreciated?
Yes. For me, I'm an artist. I have to feel everything to interpret it to a picture or to a visual. So I have to feel everything. And this is how I deal with my art. So being an artist, I have to to speak to the world, to everybody through my art, then I have to feel everything around me and then make it a story. Sometimes make it funny story, sometimes make it as sad as it could look. Sometimes you make it happy and funny. So it's under, with everything going on around me. Being one of the staff, the good thing I get through the agency I work with, the good training, the support of the training, the knowledge. So I go through a lot of trainings, knowledge, and the values. And so this is the American values I learned before I came to the United States. So getting educated about everything that I'm dealing with, this is a good values. Then came in as a person who care, and then leading this life with the experience that I get through the training and understanding, and then knowing the rules, knowing how to deal with everything around me. So this is a good thing. But at the same time, I find myself, for me, I went to school for interior design. I get a degree in interior design for a lot of reasons. One of them is the weather, the piling snow out there. It's not the climate, or it's not the environment that I work at. When it comes, it's a little bit hard for me to deal with the snow. So this is one of the reasons I didn't go work in the interior design. I went and find a job in home care. First off, it get me a family. I have a family. I care. We have memories. We have stories. We have a lot of things we share together. So for me, it's a need as a person, as a human. So, but it's still, the life is not gonna stop. Still, I need gas for my car. Still, I need food on the table. I need to support the people over there. So, but the good thing that this agency cares. I felt I belong there. Somebody care about everything I'm doing. Not only the training, but about the values, about somebody coming from a different background. So we have an international day. Everybody make their own food. They share their own experience, their own stories. So this is a kind of thing that is stabling, the well-being among the community. So you have all of this challenging about, being somebody who's working here, I need to support over there, but still you have a family. You cannot change your family. No, even everything happened in the life, but it's still a family, so you keep tied with your family.
Thank you. You can see from hearing from Fatima the heart that a lot of people bring to the work that they do. The next question we have is, what are the intersections of race, sex, gender, and immigration when it comes to the exploitations that we're talking about in the domestic workforce? Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to address that. As I said, my kind of area I've been looking at is specifically African-American women and men who are working as domestic servants. So I've been looking at, certainly there's waves of immigration that are happening in the late 19th into the early 20th century, where immigrant workers from different European nations are definitely being pressed into an exploitative labor market. But primarily, I'm interested in the intersections of kind of race for women of color here in the United States, African-American men and women. And one of the things that really is so frustrating about this research, or so discouraging about it in some ways, is the ways in which this problem of kind of race and servitude, this intersection of race and servitude that exists in many white Americans' minds in the late 19th century, also coming out of the legacy of enslavement, is this idea of African Americans being somehow a racial caste that belong in kind of menial occupations that should not be allowed to rise out of those positions or out of those occupations. So W.E.B. Du Bois is a very famous writer, historian, sociologist. He did it all intellectual, the late 19th, early 20th century. When he's studying in Philadelphia, he does this study of the Philadelphia Negro. One of the things he studies is occupation and the question of socioeconomic mobility for African Americans. And one of the problems he identifies right up front is this problem of this kind of idea of black servitude as kind of a natural function in white Americans' minds for where African Americans, where their place is within a racial hierarchy. And he talks about the problem of domestic service being one that is also directly linked to civil rights struggles. And I think we can kind of see that as an ongoing intersection between domestic service, race, and civil rights all the way into the post-World War II era, where domestic workers are very much part and parcel of being on the front lines of some of the great civil rights struggles of the post-World War II period. So W.B. Du Bois says he's very concerned in the late 19th century that the word or the term Negro, and that was considered the accepted term of the time period, is becoming synonymous with servant in white Americans' minds. And that's certainly one of the things that's kind of defining the parameters and expectations. Another quick problem of that relates specifically to white Americans' investment in racial stereotypes that are also coming out of Southern apologists and Northern apologists, for that matter, for enslavement, who are very invested in notions of racial servitude, mythologies of the black mammy figure. And what I find so disturbing in looking at a lot of the documentation from the 1930s is the ways in which white employers, both in the North and in the South, are shaping their expectations for household workers based on these ideas of racial inferiority, based on these ideas of kind of racial stereotypes, such as the mammy figure. So those are just some of the ways in which, unfortunately, we see race, class, and gender intersect. And I would also just say a quick note, I've just started to look at men in positions of household workers and household laborers, and that was actually quite common for Southern households to have a male worker who would be doing kind of outdoor yard work, but also heavy inside domestic work. And I think it's a real oversight of the reformers of the 1930s that they were so focused on talking about women and talking about domestic service as a women's occupation that needed to be elevated. Because I think by excluding kind of men from that conversation, in some ways, they were sequestering themselves off from higher wages, because so far the data I've looked at, African American men who are working within households in the South were paid larger wages, and nobody questioned that. And I think it has to do with this idea of, male status and certainly the patriarchal structure in which domestic service was taking place. So that's kind of another interesting aspect of women's work, I think, always in many ways, unfortunately, being denigrated and devalued in a society that absolutely relies on every aspect of women's work.
Wow, it sounds to me like digging into this research would be sort of horrifying in certain ways to some of the things you found. But I'm wondering, how different do you think attitudes are today as compared to what you've been finding?
Oh, that's such a hard question because I've been, so immersed kind of in the 1930s. I think, I'm sure you're all aware of this as well. In popular culture today, there's still many, unfortunately, references and representations of racial stereotypes, such as the mammy figure, maybe not quite as blatant or as bald or as nuanced as they are today, but they show up in different ways and in different forms, even in popular culture texts that are meant to kind of push back against notions of a racial caste system. Books and films like The Help, in some ways, actually reinforces some of these kind of assumptions and stereotypes of black women as always nurturing, always willing to help whites, and never able to speak for themselves. So it is troubling, I think, how some of these, at least popular culture stereotypes, continue in today's climate. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about that and how to, how the historical framework that Catherine's investigating threads together with actually some of the more recent higher profile policy debates about this, and also ties very closely with Fatima's story as a home care worker. The racialization and feminization of particular occupations and caregiving work in general, in a lot of different contexts, has still shaped in our very, very recent history, some of these policy decisions. So, one of the federal laws that Catherine reminded us about, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is 1938, the first time that we have the federal government setting a floor for a minimum wage, abolishing child labor, in theory anyway, creating the overtime standard that many of us are still familiar with today, after 40 hours overtime in many occupations, but not the ones we're talking about at first. So it's not until 1974 that that statute is expanded by Congress in some significant ways to cover some caregiving occupations. And even after that expansion, the Department of Labor then pulls back and pulls out home care workers from that expansion through a sort of opinion or rulemaking process, and says, we know that Congress wants to now include domestic labor, but home caregiving doesn't count as domestic labor because folks doing that work are simply, I want to use the right term, elder companions. Or, you know, in the same category, policy-wise or legally, as casual babysitters, sort of. So that legacy lives with us still until today. And just within the last decade, you know, for those of us who watch what the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board are up to on a fairly regular basis, I mean, that has been a political football. And as domestic workers and caregiving workers are organizing to try to include more and more people on those in caregiving occupations. By 2013, a lot of that pressure and momentum had succeeded in convincing the Department of Labor to reverse that position and to implement or to propose and put in place new rules. Before they could be implemented, they're, you know, tied up in court challenges and sort of off the table under the current administration's Department of Labor. But I mean, just as a reminder that as home caregiving has, on the one hand, become more and more professionalized, and I think Fatima spoke eloquently to that, the fact that more and more of it, partly because of our Medicaid system, is now being provided through agencies, both public and private agencies, where there are some regulatory standards. There can sometimes be excellent training and certification attached to it, so there's a movement toward professionalization of that occupation, and yet home care workers are still not entitled to overtime pay, for example, the way that we think most occupations are today. So that is, you know, continues to be one of these high-profile debates we're having in our own country. Do people doing the kind of work Fatima's doing deserve overtime pay after a certain number of hours? So to go back to where we started, you know, the expectation that you know, either a woman's work is never done or a caregiver's work could be 12 to 16 hours a day, every day, without necessarily any additional compensation. That is still the law of our land, right? Just to sort of bring home the implications of that.
Which I found personally shocking when I interviewed you. Like, that's not, I think that's not something that a lot of people realize. Fatima, do you have anything to add to this question about the intersections of race, sex, and gender and immigration when it comes to this work and exploitation before we move on to our next question?
Well, actually, I just would like things to stable. I've been realizing recently something being changed. Like, for example, I don't know how to classify it or where to put this questions, but something being changed all the time about healthcare. Like, for example, first time I came to United States, my healthcare is covering everything, and through the time things been changing. I don't know. Is this because you're an immigrant, or I don't know. And they ask you questions like they never ask you, how do you get your citizenship? Are you born here or born outside? This is a little bit of, you know, I don't know how to, but it's something for me, I said, question mark. So a lot of description or it's not covered. Plus, yeah, for home care, I prefer, for me as an immigrant, sometimes there is a little bit different of ideas, different of, you know, cultural, some different of, you know, like I have to work in a certain type of people, not to work with a certain type of people. So I would like to educate people about these values so we don't clash. Like, for example, I can't work with male because I just having in my life work with male, and sometimes there is physical issues. I can't lift like a lot of heavy weight, and I have to. And sometimes it's a value, it's a faith. Like now we have people understand that people have a Muslim faith have to pray 5 times a day. Imagine 5 times a day you go wash and then go do your prayer. So you have to educate the people you work with about the thing, so it doesn't clash and it doesn't make, a little bit. So other person can cover you. You have coworker, you have to teach them. So this is things we deal with it through the time, and we came to an agreement through the time. Like one of the time we've been in the school district talking about getting a holiday in the Muslim holidays. We've been debating, and we make a conference how people who believe in these holidays could get a day off in their holiday. So I think this came through understanding and through sitting together around the table to talk about different ideas and different beliefs and different backgrounds. So always, always education and try to understand the other part of the family is a good thing to bring people together.
On this point, too, I have something to add. I interviewed a cleaning service in Fairfield, which is where I live, and it's run and operated by a Mexican immigrant. And so I had some conversations with her about her experience starting this business. And one thing that she brought up to me was just that a lot of the people who she employs are also immigrants from different areas of the world. And she was just saying that one thing that she found insulting was when people who worked, clients would ask her immigration status and would just sort of assume that she was here illegally. And that was something that she felt uncomfortable with. Another thing that I thought was interesting from the interview was just that a lot of times people hire someone personally to come into their home to do domestic work, thinking that that might be like the best way to go. And really, she felt strongly that it was better to work for an agency, which it sounds like you work for an agency, Fatima, but that she was able to provide a more steady work environment where the people who were working for her wouldn't just suddenly have their hours cut unexpectedly. They could sort of weather the storm more of having potentially people, not want their house cleaned anymore for a while, and that being okay because they have enough client base to keep things stable. And also to have all of her employees, everyone who works for her, they're all employees, also be paying into Social Security, so there's some security for their future, because that's a huge issue in this area, is that a lot of people are getting paid under the table, and they might be pocketing more in the moment, but there's not really any security for their future. And so that's something that people, I think, aren't very aware of too. On this point, I think we can move on. We want to stick to, we're almost to the time where we're going to be answering questions. But you talked a little bit about movements to professionalize this work. I wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about that before we start the questions
I had
and
just
answers.
a couple of thoughts that actually relate directly to what Fatima was saying about kind of trying to educate employers and the importance of educating employers, and really the reform efforts that are happening in the 1930s that are happening among organizations like the YWCA, which is working locally in communities, and then also at the state level to try to create standards for wages, trying to create standards for household workers and employment, are really at the forefront, if you will, of attempts to change the culture of employers in terms of how they think about wages. Another group I've looked at is a Southern Progressive Interracial Organization that gets established after World War I, and they too are very interested in trying to improve the situation for domestic workers. And one of the things they have in common with the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor is that because they can't get legislation passed that would mandate these things in terms of higher wages and better hours and kind of recreation and rest for household workers, is to try to make employers aware of these issues and aware of these problems on a kind of a national level. So Mary Anderson becomes the director of the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor and serves in that capacity from 1918 to 1948 through many different presidential administrations. And she herself, interestingly enough, was an immigrant to the United States from Sweden. She herself actually started off as a domestic worker because that was one of the jobs readily available to her as an immigrant to the United States. And so domestic workers were kind of very near and dear to her heart in terms of trying to improve their situation. So she ends up doing a whole series of radio speeches, trying to get employers aware of the problems for domestic workers in terms of low wages. She does a lot to try to publicize through pamphlets and other forms of kind of panels and presentations this idea of a living wage for workers. So not what the market will bear in terms of what can you as an employer get away with in terms of kind of what is, you know, what's the lowest amount you can get a worker to come in and do work for you, but specifically to think about the workers' expenses. So one of these organizations and also the YWCA create charts that they hand out to household employers that also are voluntary contracts that specify all of the different expenses that household workers have. So what does it cost them to get to their location of work if they're not a live-in worker? What's streetcar fare worth? What does it cost them to feed 3 children or 2 children if they're their primary breadwinner? What does it cost them for not only housing, but what does it cost for electricity? What does it cost for, so what are all the hidden costs that workers have? And really trying to educate employers to think about those hidden costs when factoring into what would be a fair wage. They're also not above kind of trying to get at kind of this culture of shaming employers who are kind of going with the bottom line, saying, don't be a chiseler, you know, be a good, fair employer and sign these voluntary contracts. As you can imagine, unfortunately, voluntary contracts and kind of this problem of public education for employers wasn't always, I think, as successful as it should have been, and legislation was really needed.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add about movements to professionalize domestic labor?
Thinking about, I mean, I highly recommend, you know, taking a look at the National Domestic Workers Alliance website, domesticworkers.org. So, you know, lots of information about, like, I would say the largest U.S. Movement right now, and particularly the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights initiatives that they have successfully implemented in several states already, and are trying to move up to a federal level. And people may have, you know, heard, particularly in Iowa, you know, Kamala Harris is an example of, and I think particularly because she comes out of California, where there's a very strong branch of the Domestic Workers Alliance, where they've already implemented some of the provisions, protections for domestic workers that don't exist federally, but on the state level. You know, she's made that a platform of her campaign, or part of her platform in her campaign is support for a federal version of that. And the other thing that I'm thinking, listening to both the historical context and the contemporary stories, and again, bringing this kind of back to home, very local, is the desperate need we have for cross-issue coalitions on this issue. So, I mean, we're talking about a problem that is not just about devaluing certain people's work, but it's about devaluing each one of our own lives, right? So, you know, if we think about the tensions that have often arisen historically, and that I will say we even faced right here in our own backyard when we were many people in this room, you know, we're part of pressing for a higher minimum wage, even in Johnson County. You know, some of the roadblocks and the local hurdles were having some kind of difficult discussions with care providers who are between a rock and a hard place, including agencies that are dependent on what does Medicaid provide in terms of reimbursement for that very critical, important care, and what can they afford to how can they afford to compensate their employees? So we, you know, movement on these issues requires coalitions of people from the disability rights community, the healthcare rights community, and the labor community, because both sides of that equation are affected. You know, and it reminds me of, you know, these are intimate settings where that, you know, what is powerful in many cases is the kind of learning up close and personal that people do about each other's lives in this kind of employment relationship. But also the heartbreak and tragedy of not being able to remedy the deficiencies in our system on an individual level in those relationships. I mean, it reminds me of, I'll just tell one 20-second story and then we should open up for questions, I think. The former president of our State Federation of Labor, who was disabled for most of his life, significantly in a wheelchair, toward the end of his life ended up periodically in and out of nursing homes, needing nursing, full-time care. And, I'd be on the phone with him and what he'd be ranting about was how furious he was at the way the certified nursing assistants caring for him were being treated. And not, and his frustration at not being able to do something for them right there, getting to know them. And I think the powerful potential we have to build movements of people who are, if you've got somebody in your home, whether you're employing them directly or through an agency, you're then part of that system, that we have to have employers and clients as part of the movement to raise expectations and standards. So.
Well, yeah, as expected, we could talk for a long time about this, but let's turn it over for questions from all of you.
I was kind of wondering, as we talk, you mentioned that there might be some distinctions between kind of public and private agencies as we think about the professionalization of this type of work. I was wondering if you could touch on kind of what those differences might be and how that relates to kind of the path forward for better regulations and protections and kind of the opportunities and challenges with both.
I guess my gut response to that is that a lot of that has to do with funding, structural funding of our healthcare system and our caregiving system in general. And I'm not sure that there's a huge distinction between how that funding flows to public and private agencies, except that private agencies also are attempting to recoup some sort of profit, right? So there's that distinction. And I don't know if you have anything to add, Fatima, or if you've had experiences with multiple agencies or just the one that you work for now.
Actually, it depends on sometimes how they get the funds. I mean, like for example, some funds came directly from the Medicare. Sometimes the fund came to the agency, and then from the agency get to the individuals. Or the agency is gonna be the representative, the one who is gonna deal with the funding, and the one who's gonna deal with all this paperwork.
Yeah.
But I think this is the only two differences between how it's private or public.
And of course, the replicated inequities of those who have the means and ability to hire privately certain kinds of care versus most home health care is subsidized and being provided to people who don't have those means. So, yeah.
I'm particularly interested in the intersection of religion and this issue. Good employers may be coming from other religious groups that have been discriminated against. It's like listening to Fatima talk, the issues for Muslims of having sufficient time and place and coverage to observe prayer 5 times a day, and play that up against what was, I think, traditionally a kind of pattern here in the U.S. during civil rights era advances that perhaps Jews, as a previously much discriminated against group, were more welcoming of other religious or social minorities, that sometimes Jews were better employers of domestic or health or care workers. And has there been any teasing out of facts or discussion about this issue of religion
historically or in a contemporary setting? Are you more interested in? Yeah.
I guess, I think perhaps as an historian yourself, that we might start there,
Right.
but then in today's context as well, with challenges being seen particularly by the Muslim community coming here and seeing whatever they see.
I think it would be, it would make life much easier for historians and everyone else if we could, take groups and say, this group, is definitely doing better in this category than other groups. Certainly, there's a long tradition of Jewish Americans being very involved in the civil rights movement in the post-World War II era. And then there's also a lot of divisiveness that occurs for various reasons between Jewish Americans and African Americans struggling for equality. I kind of find that in the literature that I'm looking at is that, employers are so individual in terms of how they behave and whether or not they're good employers or poor employers in terms of kind of the going culture of it. So,
Despite any kind of religious.
right, and I actually, there's some letters, some of the letters I was looking at just recently from domestic workers. Again, these are just one-off kind of letters that you're looking at and don't have any larger context for. Sometimes there's not even a name, so you can't necessarily try to trace these people through the census. But some of those letters were actually complaining that Jewish employers were, the worst of all in terms of being tight-fisted. And I think, some of that is coming again from racial stereotypes, right, about various ethnic minorities. But nonetheless, is kind of showing diversity of views in terms of employers' behavior that isn't necessarily attached to any specific religious group identity. But an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, it kind of highlights the problems with not having this work be regulated too, to be relying on,
Yes.
someone being a better employer than the other. If there's no regulation, you're just kind of hoping for the goodwill of your employer. So that seems problematic. Does anyone else have a question? We have
I think we have time
couple
for
more
one
minutes.
more. Yeah. Yes.
Katie, you mentioned the book The Help, and you and I have talked about that. Do you have any recommendations for a book about domestic service in those times that is actually, good history?
There are some wonderful books out there that are anthologies, actually, of oral history interviews that were done with both domestic workers, primarily domestic workers who had migrated from the South during the Great Migration into northern urban areas, but then also combining that with interviews with employers of domestic workers. And those are kind of fascinating, kind of firsthand, kind of gets you right into the immediacy of those relationships and the complications of those personal and work relationships. So actually one that's coming up is, and now I'm blanking on the title, but Janet's here to save me.
It's called The Maid Narrative.
Yes, The Maid Narratives,
Black domestics and white families in Jim Crow South.
which is a marvelous book that came out, I think, and now I'll forget, so not that old, but actually all of the oral histories that were compiled and done by a team of a sociologist, a psychologist, kind of they had a group of people conducting these interviews. Those oral history interviews in their entirety are about to be gifted to the Women's Archives at the University of Iowa. So that's very exciting. Oh, that's right. And we will, wow,
So we're now getting them transcribed in full.
yeah.
And in March, for Women's History Month, Catherine is going to join us, along with the three authors of that book, for a further
Yep.
conversation.
So that's a wonderful book, The Maid Narratives. But then there's another great book of specifically oral histories that were done by an African-American woman whose grandmother was a domestic servant in D.C. and who had a whole network of friends who also worked as household workers in the 1930s and 1940s. And again, I'm blanking on that title, but I can give it to you, Greg. But that's also another kind of wonderful compilation of oral history of African-American workers within the context of Washington, D.C. So there are some wonderful firsthand accounts that are, I'd say, much more reliable than the fictionalized, even as compelling as it is, the fictionalized book, The Help.
So I want to be conscientious of everybody's time, including our speakers. So thank you so much, all four of you. We really appreciate you being here today, and we hope maybe we'll see you on February 4th for the next event.
And if I can just add one more word about activism, there's some information, as I said, at the back. So if you're a person who employs household workers in some capacity in your home, there are recommended wage standards by the National Domestic Workers Alliance. They have a wonderful website. Their sister organization called Hand in Hand, which also the website is back there, also suggests to employers how to be a fair employer in today's market, what to make sure you're doing as an employer of private household workers. But I would also say, as an individual who cannot afford to hire a domestic worker in my home as much as I'd like to for a fair and living wage, there are ways as consumers we can be much more aware of the ways, even as consumers, we're participating in various inequities or supporting labor collective action. So organizations like the American Historical Association, when there was a boycott of hotel workers for coverage during slack months through healthcare, they decided to pull their reservations, if necessary, from their big annual convention to support those striking workers and to help force those employers to come to the bargaining table. So there was ways which we can think about our organizations, and then Airbnb, which I know is also highly problematic in terms of what it's done to local economies and the like. Nonetheless, Airbnb now has an employer's code of ethics that can be signed, and when you're looking for Airbnb locations to rent, you can actually see if that Airbnb host is actually complying, or at least voluntarily complying with good labor practices. So that's another really kind of important way in which I think we all participate in an economy that increasingly relies on the hard labor of domestic workers in the broadest terms. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.